In this series of videos, we're going to look at Hobbes's views on the relationship between law and justice. Here's an outline of what we'll do. We'll go through an introduction, then look at arguments for and against civil disobedience, and then talk about the importance or lack of importance of accepting your punishment if you engage in civil disobedience. So Hobbes identifies law and justice. He thinks they're just the same thing. So he thinks that an act is just if and only if it upholds a law, and an act is unjust if and only if it violates a law. Now remember, for Hobbes, when we talk about law, we're not talking about something like God's law or natural law. We're talking about the laws that people make. A law is only legitimate if it's made by a government, and that government is likely to enforce the law by punishing people who break it. Why does he think that law and justice are just the same thing? Because he thinks that there is no such thing as justice in the state of nature. There's no such thing as morally good or morally bad in the state of nature. Remember, in the state of nature, each of us has the right of nature, which is the right to do whatever we want with no obligation to stop. Well, if you have the right to do whatever you want with no obligation to stop, then there are no moral constraints on your behavior. There's no way for you to behave morally good or morally bad. Hobbes thinks that's how it is in the state of nature. The only way out of the state of nature is by having a government which establishes laws that it can enforce. And until you have a government that has established laws that it can enforce, you retain the right of nature, and therefore there is no morality. Once you have a government which will enforce laws, you've given up the right of nature, you've made contracts. Those laws embody the contracts that you've made. So it's unjust to violate them, and it's just to uphold them. We can put this with the slogan, justice is constituted by law. That is, justice is sort of built out of the law. Zinn disagrees. So Zinn holds that an action that violates the law can be just, and an action that upholds a law can be unjust. You'll notice that Zinn's view is perhaps more famously associated with the great Martin Luther King Jr. If you didn't listen to the brief introductory discussion of the life of Martin Luther King Jr. and the life of Howard Zinn, I suggest doing that. You may learn some things about Martin Luther King Jr. that you didn't know. But at any rate, Martin Luther King Jr. famously held that law and justice are distinct, that it's possible for there to be an unjust law, and it's possible for upholding the law to be unjust. And correspondingly, it's possible for breaking the law to be just. Notice for Hobbes, that doesn't even make sense. Saying that there's an unjust law is like saying that there's a married bachelor. It's conceptually incoherent, because justice and law are conceptually connected, whereas for Zinn and for King, they're entirely distinct. So how can they be distinct? Well, the divergence arises because Hobbes and Zinn agree there's some sort of higher justice, that is something that transcends man-made law, human-made law. And that higher justice is determined by moral truths that are independent of the law. Now, for King, this may be religiously based. For Zinn, it's not religiously based. But both of them agree that there are moral truths that are more important or sort of independent of human-made law. Okay, so what's civil disobedience? Civil disobedience is any act that violates the law with the intention, at least in part, of upholding a higher justice. Ordinary law breaking requires breaking the law without intending, even in part, to uphold higher justice by breaking the law. So you can think of a case like this. If I steal a loaf of bread, partly to feed my family, but partly also to protest the unjust economic situation I find myself in which I'm unable to feed my family, that, according to Zinn, counts as civil disobedience, because I'm breaking the law partly to uphold this higher justice, the idea that my family has a right to eat. Whereas if I steal a loaf of bread just because I'm hungry with no intent to uphold a higher justice, or just because I feel like it, that would be ordinary lawbreaking. Since Hobbes thinks that there is no distinction between law and justice, he thinks that civil disobedience is always unjust. It's definitional for Hobbes that civil disobedience is always unjust. I should be more careful here and say in the state of nature, civil disobedience is impossible. Because remember, civil disobedience is breaking the law in order to uphold a higher justice. Well, in the state of nature, there's neither law nor justice. So breaking the law to uphold higher justice doesn't even make sense. But outside the state of nature, Hobbes thinks breaking the law is always wrong. Civil disobedience is always wrong because law and justice are the same thing. Zinn disagrees. He thinks that civil disobedience can be just, and often, though not always, it is just. Okay, we're going to keep this segment very short, and next time the segment that explores arguments against civil disobedience will be a little bit longer. So we'll stop there.